Hello, church family. Pastor Nick here. And because this is going on social media, there might be some of you out there who are not part of our church family, but welcome to you also. Today's Thursday, March 26th, as I'm recording and posting this, and we should be having our adult Bible study this evening. But of course, circumstances being what they are, you can't come to Bible study. So I had this wonderful and inspiring thought that I will credit the Lord for. Why not bring Bible study to you? So that's what I want to try and do for the next several weeks is every Thursday or Friday, I'd like to post one of these videos. I'm going to try to keep them shorter, maybe 15 to 20 minutes in length. And I pulled this series out of mothballs. This was actually a sermon series that I did 3 years ago back in 2017 called Lord Keep Us Burning. And it's an overview of Jesus's messages to the 7 churches of Revelation. And I think that what we're going through right now as a nation and really as a world, this is a passage that would serve us well to reflect upon and help us to remember what kind of people are we to be in this kind of hour, because the church in Revelation was also facing hardship, uncertainty, and difficulty. A lot of it stemmed from persecution. That's not exactly what we're facing right now, but in principle, the truths that comforted and strengthened them are the same things that we need to hear today. So what we're going to do is I'm going to take you through verse by verse, one passage a week, and we're going to make some interpretive assertions, and then we're going to make some applications. So, what does this mean, and how does it apply to our lives today? And I think you'll find it engaging. I hope so anyway. Feel free to leave questions or comments under the video, and as much as I'm able, I'd love to get back to them. And who knows, if it leads to an additional video, just answering questions that you post, that would be great. But otherwise, I'll just respond online as much as I'm able to, and we'll keep things moving forward. So I hope you enjoy the study. We're going to break up our passage into segments, and we're going to start with verses 9 through 11. It says, I, John, your brother and co-sharer in the affliction and kingdom and steadfastness in Jesus, was on the island called Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony about Jesus. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a great sound like a trumpet saying, What you see, write in a book, and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus, and to Smyrna, and to Pergamum, and to Thyatira, and to Sardis, and to Philadelphia, and to Laodicea. The first thing John does is he defines the relationship that he has with the 7 churches. He says that he's their brother and their co-sharer. In what? What binds them together? Well, in the affliction, the kingdom, and the steadfastness that's theirs in Jesus. Think about that. How would you like that to be what defined your relationship with people? The first thing you can say about your relationship with someone is, oh yeah, we're afflicted. Oh, but we know why we're afflicted. We're in it for a kingdom, and that's why we're steadfast. And I would actually say that that is exactly why John lays out these 3 features in the order that he does. We are all afflicted and suffering, but we know why we're doing it. It's because there's a kingdom awaiting us. There's a reward at the end of this, and that's why we're going to keep on fighting, even though it's hard. We're going to keep standing fast, because above all else, these things belong to us only because we're in Jesus. It's his kingdom. He is therefore worthy of affliction. He is worthy of steadfastness because it's his kingdom that we're fighting for. And he goes on to say that he was on the island called Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony about Jesus. So he is writing as one sufferer to sufferers. Those who are facing hardship and affliction, he's writing to them as one who's going through that himself. He understands. He is on that island, in that place of exile, because he would not be silent about the word of God or the testimony about Jesus. He goes on to say in verse 10 that he was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. The Lord's day simply being Sunday. Originally, Christians worshipped on the Sabbath, which is the equivalent of our Saturday, because that was the day, as people with a Jewish Israelite heritage, that's when they would worship. But because of Jesus' resurrection on the first day of the week, and because of the growing division between Jews and Christians in the first century, Sunday became the day of worship for the church. But what I really want to highlight is this phrase, in the Spirit, because you see this a lot in the New Testament. In particular, you see it used by Paul Paul uses that phrase a lot, but here it's being used by John, and they are not using it in the same way, and we have to note that. When Paul talks about being in the Spirit, he's talking about being saved. A good example of this is Romans chapter 8, verse 9. He says, if a man does not have the Spirit of Christ, he doesn't belong to Christ. He says, you are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit, if the Spirit of Christ dwells in you. So to be in the Spirit for Paul is to be born again. But here John is using it very differently. He's actually using it in a way that's closer to a state that Luke talks about in the book of Acts, but he refers to that as falling into a trance. So it's kind of a prophetic state. It's a state of heightened spiritual sensitivity where you're able to receive visions. God is about to speak to you. If you think about Acts chapter 10, Peter goes up on the roof to pray while he's staying in Joppa, and God pulls him into a trance. He pulls him into the Spirit and gives him a vision of the cloth coming down from heaven, and all those unclean beasts are on it, and he says, don't call common what God has cleansed. And that, of course, was his call to go minister to the Gentiles. So John is saying, listen, I'm not making this up. I'm not dreaming this up. I'm not being some really creative author. God pulled me into a visionary state, and he showed me things that I am commanded to share with you and write to you. And he hears behind him a great sound like a trumpet. But this sound is saying something. And the reason why that's important is because it tells us this is a voice. He's not just hearing music or hearing noise. He is hearing a voice. Someone is speaking to him. And he says, what you see, write in a book and send it to the 7 churches. What's really critical here, and that we have to understand, is that these churches were contemporary with John. Because very often we think that the book of Revelation is all about the future. It speaks to the days that are ahead and things that are to come. But actually, the book of Revelation speaks mainly to the present. All of these churches existed in John's day. The voice doesn't say, write these things down so that future generations can be made to understand. No, write it down so that these present people of God can know what God says to them in their situation. Segment 2, verses 12 through 16. And I turned to see the voice which was speaking with me. And when I turned, I saw 7 gold lampstands. And in the midst of the lampstands, one like a son of man, dressed in a robe reaching to the feet, and girded around his chest with a golden belt. And his head and hair were white like wool, white as snow, and his eyes were like a fiery flame. And his feet were like fine bronze when it has been fired in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of many waters. And he had in his right hand 7 stars, and a sharp double-edged sword coming out of his mouth, and his face was like the sun shining in its strength. So John turns to see who this voice is, who's commanding him to write these things down. He sees 7 golden lampstands, and in the midst of them, he sees one like a son of man. And this is taken directly from Daniel chapter 7. In Daniel chapter 7, he sees the Ancient of Days, which is Yahweh, God of Israel, sitting on the throne, and then a human figure riding on clouds, an activity that only a divine being could perform, approaches the throne and is given power and authority to rule forever and ever. John takes that phrase and says, this is Jesus. He is the Son of Man. And he's dressed in a robe, reaching to the feet, and girded around his chest with a golden belt. This is speaking of royal and priestly attire. So he's kind of a priest king, if you will. Those were 2 roles that could never mix in the Old Testament. A priest could not be king, and a king could not be priest. Saul and Uzziah were 2 men who defied that, and they were punished for it severely. But then it gets very interesting. In verse 14, it says his head and hair were white like wool, white as snow. So this section about the color of his head and hair, this is also taken from Daniel 7. But it's not about the Son of Man, it's about the Ancient of Days. Now, why is that important? Because John is not only saying that Jesus is the Son of Man who came riding on the clouds, the one who's been given authority and power to rule forever and ever, but he is also God on the throne. And the fact that he is called in Daniel 7 the Ancient of Days, this speaks to both his eternality, He exists before time and outside of it, and it also speaks of his sovereignty. He is in control of all things. Nothing in history can take place outside of the bounds of his authority. There is no power or plan that can succeed against him or against his plans. He is the eternal, sovereign God, the Ancient of Days. And John says, yes, that's who Jesus is. Not only is he the ruling Son of Man, not only is he our priest king, but he is God on the throne. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And he goes on to say that his eyes were like a fiery flame, which is most likely speaking of his omniscience. And it being his eyes is very important because it means he sees everything. In this case, he sees the affliction of his people. His eyes are on you, church. His eyes are fixed on you, and he will not turn away from you in your hour of need. His feet were like fine bronze when it's been fired in a furnace. And this would be a reference to his glory and also to his stability as a ruler. He walks in glory, so to speak. His voice was like the sound of many waters. And the sound of many waters, it doesn't mean that his voice was just noisy or loud. It means that it was permeating. If you've ever been in a room that maybe the volume wasn't deafening, but it was quite noisy, there was a lot going on, a lot of activity, and it just fills your senses. It permeates your senses. You step into a quiet room or you step outside, out of that environment, you can feel the difference. That's what John is driving at here. His voice just permeated and filled my senses, and I couldn't escape it. In his right hand he had 7 stars. A sharp double-edged sword was coming out of his mouth, and his face was like the sun, shining in its full strength. So when it says that he holds the 7 stars in his right hand, those are not defined just yet. They will be. But he holds them in his right hand. Stars were very commonly thought to be gods, with a little g. They were thought to be deities in the ancient world, especially by pagans, not by Christians or Jews, but by pagans, they were considered to be gods. And it was also outside the realm of man's dominion. Man had no dominion over the stars. Like when you're reading the creation account in Genesis, man is given authority and dominion over the birds of the air, the fish of the sea, and the beasts of the field. The sun, moon, and stars are beyond his grasp. But what man cannot touch, Jesus holds in the palm of his hand. So even though you have an emperor who calls himself a god, he thinks that he's a deity. Jesus says, excuse me, he can't hold stars in his hand. Only I can do that. He is no God. I am the one and only God. I am the Ancient of Days. I am the one like the Son of Man, and I have my eye fixed on you, and I will not look away. The last thing we want to look at is this idea of a sharp, double-edged sword coming out of his mouth. Well, second to last thing, excuse me. If you'll excuse my terrible artwork here, a double-edged sword is a blade that can cut in 2 directions. No matter which way you swing it, you're going to hit something. Okay? Each side is able to cut. So this coming out of his mouth, that's not literal. I mean, that would look a little odd, a little scary. It's talking about the power of his word. Jesus' word is able to facilitate the judgment of God in the earth. And judgment in the Bible cuts 2 ways. In one direction, The judgment of God means wrath for his enemies. But in another sense, the judgment of God means loving correction for his people. And you will see this word of his mouth, this sword of his mouth, swinging in each of those directions all throughout the book, especially in the sections that are coming. Now, his face shining like the sun in its strength, this is really key because this is one of the few places it's not taken from the Old Testament, but from John's personal experience. What personal experience? Well, it's from the Mount of Transfiguration. When Jesus took Peter, James, and John up on that mountaintop and unveiled his glory to them, definitely in a limited sense because they didn't die, but he was transfigured before them. It says that his face was like the sun shining in its strength. And so here again, John is almost going back to the way that he wrote his gospel and the way that he wrote his first letters. I'm talking to you about someone that I have seen with my own eyes. I have touched with my own hands. I laid my head in his bosom, and believe me, he's God, and you can trust him. Our third section, verses 17 through 20. And when I saw him, I fell at his feet like a dead person, and he placed his right hand on me, saying, Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last, the one who lives. And I was dead, and behold, I am living forever and ever, and I hold the keys of death and Hades. Therefore, write the things which you saw, and the things which are, and the things which are about to take place after these things. As for the mystery of the 7 stars which you saw in my right hand, and the 7 gold lampstands, the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. So when John sees Jesus, he has a reaction that is drawn straight out of Daniel chapter 10. When Daniel sees the heavenly messenger sent to communicate God's promised plan for Israel, he is overwhelmed by his glory and he collapses as though dead. But then that angelic messenger places his hand upon Daniel and revives him, puts him back on his feet again. And that's exactly what happens here between Jesus and John. John is overwhelmed by the glory and the beauty of the Son of God in front of him. He collapses as though dead, but then Jesus places his hand upon him. Now, what's interesting is that in Daniel, it doesn't say which hand the angel placed on him, but here it's very specific, and it says his right hand was placed on John, and the right hand usually speaks of favor and authority. So just an expression of his love for John as his messenger, as his servant, but also a statement about his power to revive his people when they're overwhelmed. And he says to him, don't be afraid. I am the first and the last. That's a very important phrase. Very often when we hear this phrase talked about, the first and the last, we generally think that it's a statement about God's eternality. But it's actually not a statement about eternality. This is a statement about Jesus' sovereignty. Why? Because I am the first and the last cannot be the eternality of God, because though Jesus was in existence before all things, first, he's not going to outlast all things. He doesn't want to outlast you. He wants you to exist for eternity with him in heaven, in the new heavens and the new earth. He wants you to exist with him and last forever with him. So saying that he's the first and the last doesn't have to do with his nature as the eternal God. It has to do with his sovereignty, the fact that he is both bookends of the plan of God. He is the first element of God's plan. He's the last element, the fulfillment of it. He's the beginner of God's plan for history, and he is the concluder, if you will, of God's plan for history. He is the first and the last. He is completely in control, and John and his readers do not have to be afraid. And it's very fitting that he goes into verse 18 when he says that he's the one who lives and was dead, and now is living forever and ever, and he holds the keys of death and of Hades. What were the first century Christians at this time being threatened with? Well, death, potentially. We're going to find in Pergamum, one person had already been martyred for the faith, and more were on their way under this emperor's rule, Emperor Domitian at this time. And so Jesus saying, listen, I'm the one who lives. I was dead, but I conquered death, and now I'm living forever and ever, and I hold the keys. In other words, I have the authority and control over death and over the grave, because that's what Hades means. I have authority over them. There is no threat the Roman Empire can make against you that has any power apart from what I allow. They don't have control over your life. I do. Your life is not in their hands. Your life is in my hands, and you do not need to be afraid. Now then, the most important part of this passage comes into view. In verse 19, he says, therefore, and a very, very good interpretive question to ask yourself is, what is the therefore? Therefore. What's it doing? Well, therefore simply means because of what I just said, because of what I've told you so far, here is how I want you to respond. And the therefore is pointing back to everything Jesus has said about himself. In other words, because of who Jesus is, John must write. John must write everything that he saw, past tense, everything that is, present tense, and everything about to take place, future tense. Everything that's about to be said is to be understood in light of the reality of who God is. He is the almighty sovereign Lord over all, not just creation, but over all of history. He is in control of the fate of the people of God, and that is why God's people need not be afraid. And in verse 20, he goes on to further describe his authority. He speaks of the mystery of the 7 stars that were in his right hand and the 7 golden lampstands. The stars are angels, and the lampstands are the churches. Now, angels is variously understood. It's generally 2 different ideas. One, that it's speaking of pastors, which doesn't have a lot of scholarly support that I've come across or am aware of. Generally, it's accepted that these are good spiritual beings. These are angelic beings that serve God, and they have some kind of stewardship over local churches. Now, we're not given detail about what that means, but you do very often in Scripture, Old and New Testament, see angelic beings very concerned over the way that people are reverencing and worshiping the one true God of heaven. But that would be another discussion for another time. So these stars that Jesus holds in his hands, think about the power again that this is conveying. He has authority over the hosts of heaven. He has authority over heaven's armies, the heavenly stewards of God's court. They bend to him. He holds them in his right hand. And the 7 lampstands that he's walking among are the 7 churches. So in some ways, the lampstands point us to 2 realities. One, it's the nearness of God's presence. Jesus is walking in their midst. He is with the Laodiceans. He is with the Ephesians. He is with the Philadelphians. His presence is with and among them. He walks among these lampstands. And they also speak of the church's responsibility. Why? Because the lampstand, that's coming from tabernacle and temple imagery. Inside the tabernacle, the lampstand was the only source of light in the room. And the church being likened to a lampstand, not in a tabernacle, but out in a community. The church is the only source of light in many ways that the communities of this fallen world have. And so being likened to a lampstand is basically being called the light of the world in a more poetic way. We are the city set on a hill, and we have a responsibility to represent God to our communities around us. We are his temple. If you went to the temple of Zeus or the temple of Athena back in ancient Greece, you could count on meeting a prophet or oracle of that deity because they were possessed by an evil spirit that claimed to be that deity. You came in contact with the God. And so the question becomes, who do people come in contact when they who do people come in contact with when they encounter us? When they come to our churches, are they encountering the one true God, or are they finding something else? And that's what the messages that Jesus is going to speak to the churches focus on. Let me give you three major takeaways from the passage that we just worked through. First of all, Jesus has a word for where we are. Remember, he is not telling John to write down what he sees and is about to see so that future generations can read it, though that is going to happen. His stated purpose is write down the things that you see so that these present churches that are existing right now at the same time as you, John, write it down so that they can read it, because I care about what they are going through in their present moment. The book of Revelation isn't just designed to speak to the future and tell us about the things that are coming. It's also a book about the present. It tells us as the church how to live and how to conquer in the place that we're in. Second takeaway is that we have every reason to trust Jesus as our almighty and sovereign God. Think again about the incredible imagery that John uses to describe him, pulling so much out of the Old Testament, in particular the book of Daniel, to point us to the fact that Jesus is omnipotent. He is sovereign over all of history. He's the first and the last, the conqueror of death. Out of his mouth comes that sharp two-edged sword. He has the power and authority to both afflict and judge the enemies of God, and also the authority to lovingly chastise the church when she needs it. We have every reason to trust him. The third major takeaway is that the evidence of our trust is our willingness to listen. And this is what's going to set the tone for the remainder of the messages in the book of Revelation, chapters 2 and 3 that we're going to be reviewing, because each letter ends with Jesus making the declaration, whoever has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. And so the evidence of our trust, if we really believe in and trust who Jesus is, if we are confident that he's everything John is declaring him to be in chapter 1, really that he is declaring himself to be in chapter 1, we evidence that trust by listening to him, by giving him license to say whatever it is he says we need to hear, whatever it is that our hearts need to take in. He has the right to speak it to us as his church, whether it's a message of comfort and exhortation and encouragement, or if it is a bit of rebuke, calling us back to our first love, as we're going to hear even next week when we jump into the message to the church at Ephesus. But these are the three takeaways that I feel we need to walk away from this study from. Jesus has a word for where you are. Whatever you're facing, we're in different states right now. Some people are waiting for employment opportunities to come back. Some are trying to plot their next trip to the store, wondering if they need to take a mask or if it's safe to go out. There's a lot of uncertainty surrounding us right now, but Jesus is able to speak to you in your situation, where you are at this present moment, and he cares about you. He cares about what you're facing, and you can cast all your anxieties upon him, knowing that he cares for you. We have every reason to trust him because he's our almighty and sovereign God. There is nothing that can defeat God, his love for you, or his promises to you. So trust him. But let that trust, first and foremostly, be evidenced by a willingness to listen to him, to listen to what God speaks, no matter what level of obedience it may call you to. If it's an easy kind of obedience or a difficult kind of obedience, give him that loyalty. Give him that allegiance. Give him that affection of your heart, because he truly is worthy. God bless you, and we'll see you next week.